Welcome to the first part of a few parts where I am trying to explore and learn JavaScript object-oriented programming. And I'm going to try to put together a few examples and explain my understanding of how objects, the relationships between objects in JavaScript work, and what JavaScript's doing behind the scenes. Just a disclaimer, I am a student and so this is definitely a learning exercise for me. I am a student in Launch School, and if you have seen some of the other content put out by Launch School, there is one particular video by Schaul that I borrow heavily from in his diagrams and his explanations. The link for that video is in the comments. A big recommend for that. There's a lot of great content in there, which you'll see I borrow heavily from. I'm just trying to explore kind of my own route and just help myself learn by explaining and recording while I do so. So let's just start off with an object here, pipe, and let's go ahead and let's here just to kind of emulate what we're doing on the code half on this side. Okay, so there we have it. We have our pipe diagram object. We have a couple properties on it: a property name, a property date created, a string never value. This is object literal syntax, super basic. We're just going to start off with the basics and try to work our way up from there, and then we can log the values using JavaScript dot notation syntax, and we can run this and see the expected values to be logged. This is not a pipe, 1929. Okay, we can even put a function because functions are first class objects in JavaScript, so we can pass them around just a function into our object. Okay, so we've added our declare name function. The declare name, the property name, we have this function, that's its value. Let's go ahead and let's change this to the shorthand syntax. Okay, there we have our function in shorthand syntax, declare name, same function, and when we use our method call for the declare name function on the pipe object, it logs as expected. This is not a pipe. And let's go ahead and let's update our diagram to include our function value over here as well. So we've updated our diagram. It includes the same properties, same values as we have defined here over in our code. All right, well, what is going on here? Where does this object pipe come from? What's JavaScript doing behind the scenes? Well, funnily enough, this object is constructed using a function, and we can access that and find out what function constructed this object when we use our pipe.constructor property call. Okay, so here's our pipe.constructor. We're looking for the value that's at this property on pipe, and indeed we see down here it's a function by the name of object that is the constructor for this pipe object. Okay, well, where's constructor? We have properties here: name, date created, declare name. All these properties exist on the pipe object. Where's constructor? It's not there. Well, this starts getting to the prototypal nature of JavaScript, and this is where JavaScript is accessing an internal prototype property on every object. Every object in JavaScript has an internal prototype property. I updated our pipe object diagram to include this internal prototype property. It's a hidden property. You can't access it in your code. You can try, go for it. But it is still an internal property on every object. In this video, I'm going to refer to it as the hidden prototype reference. And we'll see that JavaScript, when it looks for a property on an object and doesn't find it, it's going to look up the prototypal chain, which we'll explain in just a minute. It's going to look up the prototypal chain by accessing the object that this hidden prototype reference is pointing to, is referencing. So how do we find out what this hidden prototype reference is pointing to? Well, there's a couple ways that we can get JavaScript to tell us what this hidden prototype reference is pointing to. A hidden prototype reference, we can look at pipe.dunderproto. There's double underscore proto, and that will give us it will reveal what this hidden prototype reference is on pipe. We can also use the get prototype of method and pass in an object, and it will do the same thing. It'll show us what this hidden prototype reference is. So now let's go ahead and look at and see what it's pointing to. It's pointing to object.prototype. Alright, so let's go ahead and update our diagram here now that we see we have a function named object, and we can also see object has a prototype property on it. So let's update our diagram here. There, we've updated our diagram. We have our function by the name of object, and we know that in JavaScript every function is an object, so I'm going to keep it in the same kind of object diagram. And we've also seen that on object we have prototype property. Okay, so we have prototype property there, but wait a second, and we know that the get prototype of method is accessing the reference for the hidden prototype reference on pipe, and that is the same as the object referenced by object dot prototype. So we know that this hidden prototype reference on pipe is pointing to this prototype object. This object stored at the, or referenced by the prototype property on the function object. Okay, well, wait a second. Two prototypes? Object has two prototype properties? Well, this, my friend, is where the great confusion comes when learning about how JavaScript handles object-oriented programming and the prototypal chain. Unfortunately, they are both named the same thing. But that's not to say that they are. We see prototype is an explicit property. We can access it in our code. It's right there on object function, but the hidden prototype reference is not accessible in our code. You can see why I've done this differently. So we know that every object reference, so I went ahead and included this on all of our objects here so we can see that each one of them is pointing to something. Okay, well, we kind of glazed over this pipe.constructor. We still don't know where that constructor property is. So let's keep digging a little bit to uncover where JavaScript is accessing this property. So we're going to use the hasOwnProperty method, and we're going to call that on the pipe object to see if pipe object has its own property of constructor. It does not. Okay, so if it doesn't have it, how is it accessing it? Well, this is what we were talking about. JavaScript uses the prototypal nature. If it doesn't find a property on this object, what does it do? It looks at the hidden prototype reference, which is pointing up to object.prototype. Okay, so let's go ahead and search on object.prototype to see if it has this property constructor. We're going to use the same method call, but this time we're looking at the object.prototype object that we know that JavaScript's hidden prototype reference is pointing to. And there we go, true. Okay, so we can now add constructor to our. So we add our constructor property, and where is it pointing to? It's pointing to this function named object. So it's pointing here to function object, which is the function that constructed pipe. Okay, so still pretty basic here. We have our object literal syntax for pipe. So let's go ahead and let's just add another plain object here and see what it looks like. Alright, we have another plain object that we've created. Man, two properties, name, date created. We have the diagram over here for that. Any guesses on where the hidden prototype reference is going to point? Give you a minute, think about it. Boom. Alright, the hidden prototype reference for the man object is pointing to the same thing. It's pointing to this prototype object on the object function, which makes sense. JavaScript uses the object function to construct objects. Okay, so I think we've kind of answered that question. But let's go ahead and let's dig a little bit deeper. We have these two objects. They're plain, kind of straightforward. We're using object literal syntax up here. Let's kind of look and see and flesh out some of the relationships around this object function, because it has a hidden prototype reference. Where does that point? And this object itself, the object function, since all hidden prototype reference, where does that point? Let's get rid of our just simple object literals down here, and let's start taking apart some of the relationships up here in the object function. Okay, so we've cleared out our plain old objects. We are back up with this function object that just lives in the heavens of JavaScript. And we can still see our other tests hold true. Object.prototype, so this object at the prototype property on an object still has its own property constructor. It's true, and that constructor still points to a function whose name is object. Alright, so these things are true. But let's look at this hidden prototype reference for each of these, and let's see where each of these points. Okay, we have the hidden prototype reference on the prototype object of the function named object, and so that's it, folks. That's the end of the line. Well, if that's the end of the line, where does this hidden prototype reference point? Does it point up here? Let's find out. Alright, and there we have the function object, which we can see the object.getPrototype of this object here. Its hidden prototype reference, where is that pointing? It's pointing to an object function, and the prototype property, there's an object there. Okay, well, any guesses on where the hidden prototype reference for this object is going to point? There we go. The hidden prototype reference for this, the prototype object on function, points back to the prototype object on object, which we know then ends in null. So we can start to see maybe the chain is starting to close itself off. But wait a second, this object function, where's its hidden prototype reference? Let's find out where that's going. Alright, so now we are getting the prototype of this object, which is the function. And what is it? It is set, the hidden prototype reference is pointing at this object, which is at the prototype property on function. Wow, this is getting really circular here. And I started actually thinking of these two items as I was going through this as kind of like the God objects in JavaScript. Like everything is self-referential, everything comes from these objects, it seems. And we're actually missing some more here. So we can see a constructor here. We don't have that over here. Does it not there? Let's check. Okay, so now we're looking at function.prototype, which is this object here. Constructor property, yep. What is that constructor property? Well, it's pointing back to function. Alright, let's go ahead and put that in then. Okay, wow, look, we have constructor on this prototype object points back to function. The constructor on this prototype object points back to object. We have all of this code verifying this. Duck's complicated to me. But the main idea that helped me, or that's helping me rather, is just to kind of follow the chain of relationships. Every object is going to have a hidden prototype object. And when JavaScript looks for a property that we're accessing in our code and it doesn't find it in the object that we're calling, it's going to look up the chain. So it's going to follow these chains until it ends with null. This is the top of the prototypal chain, and JavaScript is searching for a method or some functionality that we have. And let's go ahead and look at, well, let's bring our pipe object back and look at where some of these things go. Alright, so we have our plain object literal pipe back, and we know that the hidden prototype reference on pipe is pointing back to this object that's at the prototype, the explicit prototype property of this object function. And as expected, we are looking at has_own_property, name, date created, declare name. All of these we can see it's all straightforward. They're all properties on pipe. And we briefly talked about it earlier, but we looked at the constructor property. We saw that pipe did not have that. It wasn't on here. And we found that it was located in this prototype object. Well, where is has_own_property? How are we able to call this method? This gets into, again, just the very nature of JavaScript, the way it works, and this hidden prototype reference. So we talked about this before, that JavaScript doesn't find a property, doesn't find what it's looking for in this object. It goes up the prototypal chain. So let's actually pull up the MDN documentation and take a look, and this might start to make a little bit more sense here. Alright, so here we have the MDN web docs, and we're just looking at object, and we can see over on the left side methods that are available to objects, and we can see down here the has_own_property. This is what we were, the method we were just calling. And we can see right here, object.prototype has_own_property. So we could go ahead and put this method in this object here. Okay, so now has own property. We know that it's a method. It's located on the prototype object. In object, what else do we have in here? Is prototype of. Well, we were using that. ToString. Yeah, we use that. Okay, all of these methods here, the object.prototype, all of these you can see are located in here. So we could go through and just start adding all of these in here, because this is where JavaScript is storing all those functions. Well, what about the other things that we use when we were working with objects? Static methods. Where are these located? Well, let's just look at the notation itself. Object.create. So it looks like JavaScript is trying to access a create property, which is a function on the object. Okay, and there it is. Create is a method on the object function itself. It's not in this prototype object, which is why we have to call it differently. So if we go back to our code and we get out of the docs here, we see that object has own property create. So we're looking on the object itself. Does it have own property create? True. Yes, it does. Object itself has own property. We're looking for the has own property property and false. It doesn't have that. Well, all of this bears out what we just went through, where JavaScript is storing methods and what that means for how we can call different methods. Now's a good time to look back at a couple ways that we used early in this video to get JavaScript to tell us what this hidden prototype reference is pointing to. What are those two methods, those two ways? We have dunderproto and getPrototypeOf. Dunderproto is deprecated. I'll just talk about it briefly here, but you can look in the documents. Some people still prefer it, but you can see in the docs it does say it is deprecated. So, but let's just look and see where these things exist. Are these properties on pipe? Has own property? Pipe has own property? Dunderproto, getPrototypeOf. Any guesses? False. So my guess is you were thinking the same thing. Probably doesn't exist here because we were just talking about a few other things. So if they don't exist on pipe, where do they exist? Well, we know we're our hidden prototype reference. We're just going back up to this prototype object, which we know that's where JavaScript is looking. And we can see where it's going to access this. We're going to check on object itself, and then we're going to check in the prototype object at the prototype property on object and see, do they have own property? Just take a second here. Think about what we just looked at using our example with has own property and create. And how do we call each of these methods? And what we saw, how that lined up with the documentation. Just think about how you call and how we used dunderproto up here, and we used getPrototypeOf, how we're calling these two methods. And that should give you the answer before we even run this. All right, well, let's go ahead and run this and see if this lines up. Okay, false. So object has own property, dunderproto. So dunderproto doesn't live on this object function, but getPrototypeOf does. On the prototype object, does it have its own property, dunderproto? True. And we can see the same thing, getPrototypeOf. So we know that dunderproto lives here in this prototype object. So when you type in pipe.dunderproto, that's what JavaScript is doing. It's going up this hidden prototype reference chain until it gets to this dunderproto method, which it uses to reveal what this hidden prototype reference is pointing to. And then when we use the getPrototypeOf method, look at the way that we're calling this. It's object.getPrototypeOf. And so we can see this these checks down here line up with that knowledge that we have. That get prototype of method lives right here on this object function itself. This made a whole lot of sense to me once I started digging in and understanding the relationships between objects and what JavaScript is doing behind the scenes, and reading the documentation. I mean, I remember when I first pulled up the docs, looking at all of the different terminology and static methods, instant methods, like why do we have all this dot prototype, and how come I don't use that when I'm calling the method? And I just learning about the way things work behind the scenes was really refreshing and really helped me just understand what JavaScript is doing. And we're going to use all this knowledge as we progress and we look at different examples and how we can write object-oriented code and use this foundation of knowledge to work in our favor. So that's it for part one. Again, big idea. Every object has a hidden prototype reference. JavaScript, if it doesn't find the property on the object, it looks up the prototypal chain. All right, thanks.